Hi everyone, I'm Sharon, and today I'm going to be presenting my research study entitled Perceived Immigrant Contribution, Conceptualization, Scale Development, and Organizational Implications. So to begin, I wanted to introduce the population that we're going to be thinking about today, which is immigrants in the US. Right now, more immigrants live in the US than any other country in the world. So they comprise of about 13.7% of our total population and about 17% of our labor force. Immigrants are an integral part of the US. However, immigration issues remain highly contentious, and the merits of immigration is an ongoing debate in America. Part of the reason is because people have very differing and complex perceptions of immigrants. So on one hand, people may have more positive perceptions, such as immigrants add to job creation and the cultural diversity of our society. And on the other hand, they might have more negative perceptions, like immigrants steal our jobs and threaten our traditional values. And because people have such complex perceptions, it's important for us to better understand what those perceptions are, because they can have consequences for how people treat and behave towards immigrants. Past research, however, on immigrant perceptions has really emphasized this notion of immigrant threat. So immigrants have been viewed very negatively and warily as the other and as competitors for societal resources. One of the most prominent works on this is by Stefan et al., who identified two dimensions of threat perceptions towards immigrants. The first is realistic threat, which refers to threats to the political and economic power of the in-group. And the second is symbolic threat, which refers to threats to the traditions, morals, and values of the in-group. And these threat perceptions are really important because they've shown to have negative effects on intergroup relations, such as more negative attitudes, beliefs, and behavioral responses towards immigrant groups. However, I wondered whether this perspective was really enough to capture the whole picture. And so moving a little bit beyond threat, if you look at public data that looks at immigrants' impact on society, you'll find many different examples of how immigrants actually are really strong contributors to society. So for instance, they generate a bunch of novel inventions, they start businesses, and they bring their diverse perspectives and knowledge to organizations. So moving towards more of a contribution perspective, I felt like there was a missing perspective in the literature where immigrants are perceived as contributors and not threats. If you think about it, the absence of threat or a low value on the threat scale doesn't necessarily equate to the presence of contribution. At most, we can say that there's a lack of threat. And conceptually, threat and contribution perceptions are related yet differing beliefs. For instance, threat refers more to a taking away of resources, whereas contribution refers more to a gaining of resources, a gaining of collective resources. Threat refers more to competition, whereas contribution refers more to an interdependence and shared common goals. So we already know a lot about what leads to destructive outcomes for immigrant, non-immigrant relations, but we don't know much about what leads to supportive and positive intergroup outcomes. And so perceptions of immigrant contribution could really meaningfully add and have unique predictive power to help us understand important outcomes that we have not yet fully explored. So the aim of the current study is, one, to develop and validate a novel scale for perceived immigrant contribution, and two, to explore its general and workplace implications. Here, I define perceived immigrant contribution as the extent to which immigrants are perceived to positively impact, contribute, and benefit the society in which they settle in. In line with past research, I've hypothesized it to have two subfactors, one being realistic contribution, which is the extent to which immigrants are perceived to contribute to the economic or materialistic welfare of a society. And two is symbolic contribution, which is the extent to which immigrants are perceived to contribute to the worldview or the culture of a society. So here's a general study roadmap of the things I will cover today. It follows the scale development process outlined by Hinken in 1998. In the first study, I wanted to explore the model structure of PIC, and to do so, I examined the shared variance among the items and reveal factors that are thought to cause the observed scores. My sample is 264 participants recruited via online panels, and the items were deductively generated from past literature, news articles, and online opinion articles. From that, we created an initial pool of 91 items, which we pared down to 42 items based on non-redundancy, and participants responded to each of these items on a 1 to 7 Likert scale. For the results, we found support for a two-factor model as expected, and I interpreted loadings that were above 0.63, which are considered as very good, and selected the top 8 highest loading items for each subfactor. So here on the right, you can see the items that we ended up with and their respective factor loadings for each factor. In the second study, I wanted to evaluate model fit. To do that, I conducted a CFA to assess the model fit of the factor structure and specified the number of factors and the specific indicators that would load onto it. And to do that, I used the Lavon package in R, and my sample was 326 participants. This is a schematic representation of what the model looks like. So you can see that there are 2 latent factors and 8 items for each one. And here you can see the results from the CFA. So up top in model 1 is the 2-factor model. And I evaluated the fit based on the indice cutoffs specified by Hu and Bentler. And overall, we found an acceptable to good fit for our model with the exception of chi-square. However, chi-square tends to be quite sensitive to sample size, so that is typically to be expected. We also looked at alternative models and compared it to our original model, and in the end decided to retain the original 2-factor model based on parsimony and the fact that it is a comparatively good fit. In the third study, I wanted to look at convergent and criterion-related validity. So convergent validity refers to whether PIC is related to theoretically similar constructs, and criterion-related validity refers to whether it predicts relevant outcomes of interest. And I also here want to look at incremental validity, so whether PIC explains these outcomes above and beyond what threat perceptions can cover. Here my sample was 348 participants. After excluding people, it was 292. These are the measures that I used to look at convergent validity. So we included perceived immigrant threat, zero-sum beliefs, and social dominance orientation. These were the measures that we used to establish criterion-related validity, and we included things like feeling towards immigrants, support for multiculturalism, and a few others. The results showed pretty much what we were expecting. So you can see that realistic and symbolic contribution showed significant correlations with the convergent validity measures. In the yellow box, you can see the criterion-related validity results. So both types of contribution were negatively correlated with kind of more negative outcomes and positively correlated with more pro-immigrant outcomes. These are the results for the incremental validity. Overall, you can see that PIC predicts these outcomes above and beyond threat perceptions. So this is the second step. In the fourth study, I wanted to examine discriminant validity, so whether PIC is unrelated to theoretically dissimilar constructs, as well as concurrent validity and predictive validity, where we measure PIC at time 1 and see whether it predicts outcomes at time 2 about a month later. Third, again, we look at incremental validity. And lastly, we look at test-retest reliability to look at the consistency and stability of the PIC scale over time. My sample included 192 participants that were re-recruited from study 3 about a month later. And we also collected a new sample, sample 4, which included 321 participants. These were the measures I used for discriminant validity, so we included work passion and impression management and expected null relationships with PIC. These were the measures used for the concurrent/predictive validity. So we included things like organizational citizenship behaviors towards immigrant coworkers, willingness to befriend these coworkers, and evaluations of immigrant job candidates. So for the results, you can see, generally speaking, contribution was unrelated to our discriminant validity measures, with one small exception. And you can see that the contribution constructs were positively correlated with positive outcomes like OCBs and coworker relations and befriending coworkers, as well as the decision to hire the immigrant candidate. These are kind of echoing the results from before using the resampled sample. Here we can also see that the test and retest reliability showed really strong support at 0.77 and 0.76. And finally, again, PIC showed incremental validity and predicting these outcomes above and beyond what threat perceptions could cover. So to summarize the findings, we found support for a two-dimensional framework and support for the psychometric properties of the PIC scale. And we shed light on how these perceptions influence immigrant-directed attitudes and behaviors. So broadly speaking, PIC was negatively related to constructs that undermine immigrant groups and positively related to constructs that support immigrant groups. More specifically, symbolic contribution was a consistent predictor of positive interpersonal outcomes, and realistic contribution, although generally speaking, was also predictive of positive outcomes. At times, it also was related to more antisocial outcomes, like more counterproductive work behaviors towards immigrant coworkers, which is a really interesting finding that I think future research should look into. And of course, it showed significant incremental validity in predicting these outcomes above and beyond threat. So some theoretical and practical implications include that this assesses a previously overlooked construct where immigrants are perceived as contributors to their communities. I think it adds a much needed positive theoretical lens to unpack immigrant relations. It helps facilitate a more holistic understanding of immigrant perceptions and helps lay groundwork to understand important behaviors towards immigrants at work. For practical implications, I think that for employees and managers who work with immigrants, it's really important for them to understand how their perceptions inform their behaviors and decisions towards immigrants at work. So for example, in study 4, we found that PIC predicts a whole host of work-related immigrant outcomes like OCBs and willingness to befriend immigrant coworkers and even hiring decisions. And I think downstream, this can have implications for immigrant work experience like socialization and intercultural relations. Finally, some future directions include: where do these perceptions come from? How malleable are these perceptions? What are the consequences of these perceptions for immigrants in terms of their well-being, integration, interpersonal relationships, and job outcomes? So to conclude, our perceptions of immigrants have really important implications for how they are viewed, treated, and welcomed into our societies. PIC's strong relations with pro-immigrant outcomes can potentially highlight how we can combat prejudice and discrimination towards immigrants. Through recognition and appreciation of immigrant contributions, we can build more productive, equitable, and healthier relations. And finally, I would invite scholars to consider an alternative perspective and narrative when approaching immigrant research. Thank you very much.